And without much further ado, I would like to invite Emily Cross to the stage.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Shanti, very much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Shanti and to all the other organizers today for this really exciting event. It's so cross-disciplinary, it's transdisciplinary, it's really pushing and challenging boundaries, and it's really exciting to be a part of this. And I'm happy to be kicking off the first, I guess, empirical talk, telling you a little bit about the research that my colleagues and I do about the perception and interaction with human compared to robotic agents. So as Shanti said, my background is in cognitive neuroscience and also social neuroscience, and we're really interested in the brain mechanisms that underpin and support our ability to understand other people and non-people in our environment. So I'd like to begin by placing my research questions in a broader context. So in our daily lives, something that we often take for granted is that we are constantly observing and interacting with other people who are moving around us. So it's very important that these people are moving. It's through their movement that we're able to understand their intentions, to understand what it is that they're doing, and to infer their goals, intentions, and beliefs. Our brains have evolved over many, many thousands of years to make this quick and effortless, this work of understanding other people's intentions. So it can be as simple as tying a child's shoe or having a cup of coffee with a friend, or as complex as dancing or climbing a mountain, but we're able to interact and coordinate our actions with other people very effortlessly. So this is all well and good, but of course it begs the question, if we're so evolved and so able to interact with other people in our environments, what's going to happen, and what happens when we all of a sudden are interacting with non-human agents, so robotic agents that are becoming ever more ubiquitous in our environment? Are we going to be able to understand and coordinate our actions with them in the same way, or is this going to require something very different in our biology? So to say a little bit more about how it is we're able to so effortlessly interact with our conspecifics, our fellow humans in our environment, there's this idea of direct matching. This idea has been around for a very long time. It actually got its start with Aristotle. René Descartes also spoke about it. And then for the past 100 years or so, starting with the time of William James, there's been a lot of empirical, psychological, and now neuroscientific interest in what it is that enables us to understand other people moving in our environment. And this direct matching hypothesis simply states that we understand other people by using ourselves and our own experience as a template to make sense of others. So in this very simple example of having a cup of coffee with a friend, the idea is when you see your friend reach forward and bring her cup of coffee to her lips to drink, you understand her action by in some way playing through the motor program of what it would take for you to reach forward, bring your own cup of coffee to your lips to drink. Now, of course, you don't imitate everyone's actions that you see in your environment. This happens at a sub-threshold, implicit level. But this idea is very prominent that we use our own experience to make sense of others. And of course, we cognitive and social neuroscientists are interested in the brain mechanisms that underlie this ability. And probably many people here have heard of the concept of mirror neurons, which were originally discovered in monkeys. And they're primarily found within this premotor and parietal area of the brain. And they make up part of what we call the social brain network. And the social brain network, which also includes another part of the brain, this blue blob here, in the occipitotemporal cortices. And essentially, the social brain network is what is thought to be the biological hardware which underpins our ability to make sense of other people's actions. So again, about 20 years of research has really been probing and exploring how the social brain network supports our ability to interact and understand other people's actions. And one of the ideas that has come from research into the social brain network is the so-called like-me hypothesis. So the like-me hypothesis very simply states that not only are we biologically tuned to make sense of our fellow humans because of our own experience with our own bodies, but the more similar someone else or someone's actions are to us, the more our brains are going to respond, the more resonance there's going to be. So there's been some really elegant research with humans watching actions made by dogs or actions made by monkeys, or even people in one racial group watching actions made by people from a different racial group. That's slightly more controversial work, but the basic idea, the premise is that the more similar an agent or an action is to your own experience, the more your brain's going to respond. And that gives credence to this notion of the like-me hypothesis. So of course, that's all well and good, but we're seeing that more and more it's not just humans that we're going to be interacting with, it's also robotic agents. So robots are very much not like me in many ways, both in terms of the way they look and also, of course, in the way they move. At least they're not yet quite moving like humans. So a big question is, are we going to use these same parts of the brain, as a social brain network, which has evolved over millennia to really understand our social humans in our environment? Are we going to use these same brain regions to understand robotic agents, or do we have to rely on much different or more complex brain circuitry to make sense of these non-human agents? So I'm going to tell you about two pieces of research that my colleagues and I have done that kind of start to address these questions concerning specifically aspects of robotic movement. So what's going on with movement, and also mind. So what we believe about a robotic agent's mind. So the first study we did looked a little bit like this. And you're going to be seeing far more complex robots today, but we're going to start with something nice and simple. So we had a design here where we had both a human and a non-human agent that were moving in kind of human-y ways, for lack of a better way of putting that. So lots of effectors moving at once, the body moving many limbs at the same time, compared to the same human and robotic agent moving in very rigid, jerky, robotic ways like this. And again, this was not extremely sophisticated. We went to the toy store and bought a Lego robot that stood about a foot high, and we used stop-motion cinematography to animate his actions to look like his actions. So not the paragon of absolute sophistication, but it works. So what we did in this experiment is we scanned people's brains using an fMRI scanner while they watched movements from these 4 different cells. And our biggest question concerned, what's going on when you're seeing this kind of more natural human-like movement where lots of limbs are moving at once compared to the more rigid, jerky, robotic movement? And I'll just skip to one of the most exciting findings, and that concerns, OK, when you're seeing movement that's very smooth and kind of human-like and lots of effectors moving at once compared to the rigid robotic movement, what's going on in the brain? Now, the social brain hypothesis, the like-me hypothesis would say you're using these social brain areas, these mirror neuron areas, to really make sense of these agents, these actions that are more similar to what you can do with your own body. But interestingly, if you look at the brain here, those regions would be here, here, and here. They're silent. There's nothing going on in those brain regions at all. Instead, we see very early brain regions. This is the back of the brain here. Right here in visual cortex. These are the only brain regions that are more active when you're seeing this really kind of smooth human movement going on compared to the rigid robotic movement. So this very much goes against the like-me hypothesis. In contrast, when you're watching this rigid, jerky, robotic movement that's not very much like what you can move like yourself, here we see really broad, widespread activation of this social brain network. So this completely flew in the face of our predictions. But I have to say, we replicated this with a separate set of subjects. So we believe these data. And it seems that our brains are responding more robustly. We're using more of these social brain regions when we see movement that's not like what we can do ourselves. I'll just explain one more little finding we found that was quite interesting, and that concerns how our brains are integrating form and motion cues. So when you see a human that moves like a human, or a robot that moves like a robot, compared to a human that moves like a robot, or a robot that moves like a human, so we'll call these the congruent pairings compared to the incongruent pairings, what we see is that there's one brain region in particular, which is also part of the social brain, kind of a more temporal parietal region, which really cares about the agent and the action moving in the ways that we would expect them to move. So that's what we see in these bars here, that they're highest when the human moves like a human or when the robot moves like a robot. Interestingly, we ran a similar version of this study using the identical stimuli with 4-month-old infants. So this time we weren't using functional MRI. We were using a different technology called near-infrared spectroscopy. And we're going to show these little tiny babies these same videos. Now think about the fact that these babies have very little experience perceptually with humans, let alone with robots. And of course, they have no motor experience already with their bodies to move in any of the ways that they're seeing. So we're going to ask questions about, OK, how does the development of integrating form and motion cues come online in the human brain? And quite interestingly, we see within the left, very similar region, within the left temporal parietal area of our 4-month-old infants, that much like our adult brains, we see an identical pattern of response, such that the infant brain also responds to a human moving like a human and a robot moving like a robot, more so than the human moving in the robotic way or the robot moving in the human way. So already at this very, very young age, we have this hardwired sort of integration of form and motion cues, such that the human brain knows how a human should move and how a non-human should move, which was quite interesting. So to conclude this first study, what I think our biggest finding was that the social brain hypothesis, the like me hypothesis, would say that we would use these main nodes of the social brain network to make sense of actions that are very much like we can do ourselves. Instead, we find completely the opposite. We find that when you see these really unfamiliar, rigid robotic moves, then you see much more activity, especially within the sensory motor parts of the social brain network. So it doesn't support at all this like me hypothesis. And one of the ideas we're working with right now, but we need to collect more data to really evaluate it, is that there's probably a nonlinear relationship going on within the brain in terms of how these regions are responding with something that's really familiar compared to something that's not very familiar at all. So it could be the case we're going to see a lot of activity, a lot of blood flow in these brain regions when something is really unfamiliar to you because your brain's working much harder to predict what's going on, to think about what's coming next. You don't have a lot of templates, a lot of information yourself, so your brain needs to work harder to figure out what's going on next, compared to something that's really familiar to you. Because again, there's a ton of data that sits at this high point here. When a movement or an agent's really familiar to you, you also see a lot of activity. And we think this has to do with you having such a good idea of what's happening next, that any small deviations from that prediction are going to drive activity in that brain region more. So I'll tell you just a little bit about a second study, which was a little more concerned about interacting with human and non-human agents. And just a little bit of data about this. To study this sort of question, we used an automatic imitation paradigm, and we looked at this idea of social mimicry. So there's a ton of social psychology research that strongly supports the notion that we are mimicking other people's actions in our environment at all times, even though we don't notice that we're doing this. And this sort of implicit mimicry or imitation, it facilitates interpersonal interactions. It helps us to get on better with people in our environment. And we started this from a young age, and it continues on throughout our lives and our development. So our question is, OK, we know that we automatically imitate human agents in our environment, but what about robotic agents? What about those agents that we either know to not be like us or don't look like us at all? So we're going to test this question with actually kind of two different ways. We're not just going to ask what goes on when something doesn't look like us, but also, or doesn't look like a human, such as this Asimo robot here. If you look at this guy, you know that's not human because it doesn't look human. You have visual cues. We call these bottom-up cues to suggest that's not a human. But also if you have top-down or cognitive information to suggest that that's not a human you're interacting with. So if you know that this guy here, that Data, is not an actual human, he's an android, he might look like a human, he might move like a human, but you've been told, you have some sort of cognition that says that's not a human, how do you interact with this agent? So I won't go into too much detail of the paradigm, but just know that what we did was we showed people, again in the brain scanner, different actions, and we had them interacting with these actions in a very simple way that were either looking like a human hand or looking like a non-human robotic hand. So we had every cue to humanness here visually, and we had pretty much no cues to humanness visually in the robotic non-human hand condition. The joints weren't even attached. And then we also, to look at this cognitive question about beliefs about whether you're interacting with a human or a robot, we had a very elaborate cover story that we induced in our participants with a long video where we told them about how these videos were either made by human motion capture, so a human was in a suit or it's in a hand, and they were actually making these movements go, compared to these movements were made by computer keyframe animation. And the point here is that when you saw movements that were preceded with this sort of cue here, you thought that a human was behind making these movements. These are very human-like. And when you saw this cue here, our participants were led to believe that these were made by a computer. There's very little human involvement. This is all very automated, machine-driven, not human-driven. And again, just to jump to the most interesting finding, we were asking if there's any evidence that there's part of the brain that's really specialized in interacting with other humans, so cues that tell us that this is very much another human agent, an intentional agent we're interacting with. And indeed, we're going to look within our social brain network here, and what we found is that one node of this social brain network, this time the more temporal parietal junction region, you can see that here in our brain data, really, really cares about whether that's a human that you're interacting with. So you have to have both cues to humanness. It has to both look like a human hand, and you have to believe it came from a human via motion capture. And when you see that, this part of the brain very much responds and says, yes, that's a human. I'm going to be engaged while I control this interaction that you're having with this agent. So quite different from our first set of the data from our first study, but it does show that part of the brain is biologically hardwired to really care about human agents. So to sum up with these two sets of data, what I hope to show you with them, there's two things. First of all, when we think about our social brain, which has evolved over millennia to really support interactions with humans, we see that actually some parts of it, namely the sensory motor nodes of this, so the inferior parietal lobe and the premotor cortex, these parts of the brain don't really care if it's a human or a non-human agent. They in fact respond more to robotic movement than to human movement. So these aren't human-specific brain regions. Whereas another part of the social brain, this temporoparietal junction, it really is preferentially engaged when you're interacting with other humans, and that doesn't seem to be something that we can override if there's any cues to roboticness or to non-humanness to an agent that you're interacting with. And of course, there's myriad questions that we can follow up in this work, but one thing that I'm particularly interested in is how might increased experience with robotic agents. So there's some of you here who spend a ton of time interacting with social robots in certain ways, and if you spend a lot of time interacting with robotic agents, could it be the case that you can actually change the response, especially within this red brain region here, so that you do see and you do perceive and you do interact with robotic agents as if they're humans? So that's an open question and one that we'll be looking at in the future. So I'd like to thank my colleagues and my funders for all this work, and thank you.